Hello, this is Bill Hahn. Welcome to the IBM BPM tutorial demo series. In this scenario, we're going to be creating a process application from scratch, a build from scratch exercise. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go ahead and create a new process app. We'll call that new process app HR Hiring Headcount Request and give it a unique identifier. We'll go ahead and open up that process app in Designer and start our work. Let's create a new business process definition. We'll call that headcount request. And we'll start simple and grow fast. So let's first start out with two activities. These first two activities will be called request headcount and review headcount request. For now, we'll just keep them in the same swim lane and see if we can run this as quickly as possible. So let's go ahead and use the run button, or the playback button as we've called it, so we can play back our work in a very rapid, agile, and iterative fashion to all the stakeholders across business and IT. We'll run the process. It switches us into the inspector view, which is simply the perspective, the name we give to this perspective where we can step through the process. You can see we've created an instance of the headcount request process. We're in the request headcount step, and that's highlighted for us in the visual diagram. So we'll go ahead and claim this activity or run this task. We can see that even though we haven't implemented anything for this activity yet, it has a default user interface that gives us a little bit of information about the activity and the process it's running in. So if we continue clicking the refresh button, we can proceed through the process. We get to the second activity and we see that we've proceeded, and once we've stepped through it, we can see that the process is completed. Let's go ahead and run another instance of this process and go use it from the end user process portal. In part to prove that this process that we just drew a picture of is runnable both from within the authoring environment as well as from an end user environment like the out-of-the-box process portal, which is a lightweight web app for running and using any process app that you build. We'll log on as tw_user with the same as the password and go ahead and claim this activity. We can see information about the activity. You can see the same picture of the process is displayed to the end user. We can see information about the process itself and the step that we're at in the process. We can press the run button to claim the activity. You can see it runs exactly the same in the end user environment as it did in the authoring environment. We'll refresh with F5 to get a current view of where the process has proceeded. We'll claim this next activity, step through it, and see that we've completed the process. And indeed, it shows us information that confirms that the process instance is completed. So let's go ahead and take a snapshot, which is drop-dead easy version control. In other words, it's so easy to use that people will actually use it. So we'll take a snapshot. We'll give the snapshot version a name. We'll name this version 1, 2 activities. We can see that that shows up in our revision history in the bottom left-hand corner of our authoring environment. In the Process Designer, it's very easy to version our work along the way. That'll help us tell the story of how this process evolved later on. Let's go ahead and add a swim lane to this and name the swim lanes. We'll name this swim lane Approver, and the top swim lane we'll name that Requester. Let's move these activities around. The first activity is submitted by the requester, and the second activity is an approval step that's performed by the approver. And we're also going to have a system activity, something that is potentially performed by the system. Maybe that's a call out to a back-end system, and an automated activity that notifies the recruiter that there's some work to do in terms of fulfilling this headcount request. And there'll be a gateway involved, a decision gateway that decides whether or not the approver has approved this headcount request. So if it's approved, it'll proceed to update the backend system and notify the recruitment team. If it's rejected, it'll go back for rework to the requester. So now once we've connected up this flow, even though we haven't implemented any logic for the decision gateway, we can still run it at any time. So we'll run it frequently. We'll run it early and often to see if things are working properly. Let's go ahead and step through this. We can see that as we step through the application using the run button and the refresh button in the top there, that we are able to step through it, and for a specific reason it loops back to the beginning. Let's see why it's looping back to the beginning by taking a look at what's going on in that decision gateway. If we take a look at the property sheet, the implementation section of the property sheet, we can see, and oh, by the way, let's name these connections so that it's easier to follow in the diagram and configure in the property sheet. Let's change it from the default name, which is the name of the target activity that it's connected to. Let's change that to no, because this branch is not approved, or the branch that's taken when it's rejected. And this branch is the connection that is taken when it is approved. Now in the gateway, we can clearly see in the implementation section that the no branch is the one that is the one at the top of the list. So without any additional logic configured into the process, because we haven't decided on the logic yet, it's going to take the branch that appears first in the list. So let's change the order of these branches using these yellow arrows. Now that the yes branch, in lieu of additional logic, now that the yes branch is at the top of the list, that's the one that should be taken. So let's play it again. Press the playback button and run an instance of this process. Let's step through and see if we have reconfigured the connection or path that's taken. Now when we proceed through this process, we can see that it's the update system and notify recruiter activity isn't highlighted in the diagram because that was in the system lane, so therefore it was processed automatically for it. It doesn't need to wait for any user action. It's a system activity. And if we look at the audit trail of what's happened, we visited the headcount, the request headcount activity, the review headcount request activity, and then once the yes branch path was taken, it proceeded to the update system and notify recruiter activity. So it looks like we did influence an alternative flow. Let's put some. Let's take a snapshot to track our work, so we can tell the story of how this evolved later more easily, as well as manage our change. We'll name this version 2, 3 activities instead of 2 activities. We can see that these snapshots are available at any time. If I click on version 1, we can see the diagram immediately changes back to view of what it looked like back at version 1. And if we click on version 2, we can see that we did indeed version it. And as we'll see later, those versions are also runnable at any time. We not only see the different version of our work, but we can run it at any time as well. Let's go ahead and add some data to this process. A typical 3-step iteration that we go through is modeling a little bit of the process flow, adding some data to the process, and then implementing one or more of the activities or sub-processes in the process. So let's add some data. We'll call this this data model or data structure headcount request, and we'll create a new data type called headcount request type. So we create a new complex data type that is a nested data structure of information like ID, project, the requester, the justification, the budget. Some of these variables or some of this process data will be something other than string. Let's hit the select button here and choose, just by typing DEC, let's zero in on the decimal data type. Let's add another variable called desired start date, and we'll select a data type for that. We'll start typing DATE and zero in on the date data type. And then let's create an approved variable. This approved variable is going to be Boolean. It's either going to be approved or rejected. So Boolean is a good choice for now. Go ahead and close and save this data structure. And we'll click the Has Default checkbox so that we can easily run it immediately with some defaults. In other words, initialize it so that it can be used. And now we'll save our work. Let's work on the implementation of this first activity. Let's go ahead and use the activity wizard to get a jump start on creating this activity. And as you can see, we have the ability to jumpstart the creation of this activity as a human service with a user interface, a rule service with some rule logic, or a system service, which is the name we give to calling out to really anything in the IT landscape. via Java, web services, REST, JMS, the usual open standard suspects. So now we can continue through this wizard, and it notices that we have some data in the process. When we finish, we can see that by double-clicking into this process, double-clicking into this activity, that it has created something for us. It calls the user interfaces, the user interface screens, calls them coaches, because the spirit of this user experience is to coach the user through the process. We can name these screens whatever we like. So I'll go ahead and name this first screen, this screen we're working on right now is the headcount request form. When we double click into that, we can see that it created a starter UI for us made up of some user interface controls that are bound to the process data. So based on the process data, it created a starter form for us. We can see that by pressing the run button here, the playback button within an activity implementation, in this case a human service, we can see a little icon of a human service. By pressing that play button, it's going to run whatever this service is. In this case, it happens to be a user interface. So now, within this user interface, we can make changes and iteratively change it and test it. So let's go ahead and make this a two-column layout and drag and drop some of the contents into the second column. Once we've done that, let's play it again and see if it looks closer to what we'd like. It's perhaps a bit of an enhanced layout. Let's go ahead and make some additional changes. Let's make this justification field multiple lines high so that we have a little bit more real estate to type in a justification. When we run that, we can see that the changes are immediately available. Let's drag this down and give it a little bit more real estate yet, and see that as we make changes, they're immediately available to test. This budget field, the budget number, perhaps that should be a dollar amount, so we can use many different capabilities in the property sheet to configure that. In the case of this format field, we can choose currency. We can customize those formats and extend them. So now when we run it, we can see that it's formatted as dollars and cents. Let's go ahead and add another screen to this screen flow. And we're going to add a welcome screen so that we have more than one screen to work with. Because once we get more than one screen, it becomes a lot more interesting in terms of how we orchestrate the end user experience, as far as how we paint the flow, the navigation through multiple screens. So let's call this first screen the welcome screen. When we drill down into this screen, we'll do something very simple. We'll just put a custom HTML control out there, and we could get fancy with this, or we could just keep it simple. And in our case here, in this build from scratch exercise, I'll just type a welcome message. Proceed to fill out this form. And we might want some of the process data in this screen, so we can drag and drop out any process data, and it'll create the appropriate UI controls for us. We can also drag out a nested data structure, and you can see it creates an entire section of all of those process data fields in the UI, and it binds those data fields in the UI to the process data, so it'll display whatever data state is in the process, and vice versa. If we type something in these fields, it will update the bound process variables. So now let's orchestrate these screens. Let's draw out the screen flow. First of all, in order to do that, it might be helpful to have some back and next buttons. So let's go ahead and add a button here and name the buttons back and submit, because this is our second screen. And the first screen will have this button indicate that we can go next to the next screen. And let's go ahead and draw out the flow of these screens. And you can see as we draw the connection from screen 1 to screen 2, that what happens is that it picks up that next button. And as we draw the connection from screen 2 back to screen 1, it picks up the back button. Now if we go ahead and test this, just run it at any time, we can see that this screen navigation runs. We can see when we go from next, from the first screen to the second screen, it performs as expected. And we go back to the first screen. Now on the second screen, you can see that there's an ID field. What if we wanted to populate that with a unique ID? And maybe we want to get that ID from some enterprise system. Maybe it's a service call or a database integration or who knows what. But we want an integration implementation component that can be a reusable service, let's say.